Can you hear me from here?
Yep.
Oh, perfect. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for our moderator, Kenny, our guest speakers for lending your time and expertise, and thank you for our audience in the room and online. My name is Amber. I'm a member of Virginia Justice Democrats Steering Committee, and we're here to talk about the Virginia Way. Before we dive in, a couple of housekeeping items. We are live streaming on Facebook, as Ali mentioned, so if when in the room, we could try to keep noise down. That would be most helpful. Also, please share on our Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, ask questions. We have someone monitoring the chat online, and tag @VAJusticeDems when you tweet your favorite quotes. I'm also going to point out we do have buttons and t-shirts in the back. Would prefer of purchasing those afterwards, just for convenience, since not a ton of traffic room over there. But please be sure to check those out afterwards. Also, for those here in person, we have note cards for you to write your questions down. Just pass to the end of the row, and we will collect and share them during the Q&A section. Okay, back to why we're all here. You know the old saying, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Well, in many ways, that exemplifies Virginia. Soon after Dems took majority of the General Assembly, there were several disconcerting signs that suggested the Dems do not intend to push a bold, progressive, ambitious agenda. Many of these examples I hope we touch on today. Dems have been out of power for a generation, and now that we have the power, we don't have the political will. Why? Well, we've heard it's because they are afraid of retaining power in the next cycle, afraid of rocking the boat too much, that they don't want to turn the place upside down. We believe the real answer is because of the Virginia Way, where both parties were beholden to money and corporate interests over the will of the people. In his book, Jeff put it well,
Sorry. Nope, that's not going to work. Okay, sorry.
Oh, still good?
Yeah.
Whoops. Technology, always the thing that hampers. We believe the real answer is because, in his book, Jeff put it well. If we have any hope of advancing truly progressive policies, we need to understand how the system of bipartisan economic consensus persists, despite growing backlash. Through this conversation and future events, we hope to further define the Virginia Way, talk about Jeff's book in particular, and highlight and connect the dots for folks as to the methods and ways in which the Virginia Way works against social, racial, economic, and environmental justice for everyday working Virginians. Virginia needs a new way, one that puts people ahead of corporate money and influence. Together we can get there. Okay?
First, thank you, Amber, for the introduction. Thank you, obviously, Virginia Justice Democrats for putting this on. Thank you to our panelists for being here today. And thank you, Jeff, for, of course, writing the book. Again, my name is Kenny Bodie. I am one of the founding members of Virginia Justice Democrats. I'm also one of the, I'm the only local candidate that got endorsed list last year, right? So I'm the only local candidate that got endorsed, and I am, as of 3 days ago, the new supervisor for the Occoquan District on the Prince William County Board of Supervisors. So you might be wondering why a local elected official is going to be moderating this panel. One, because when Amber, Ali, Johanna, or Tiffany tell you to do something, you do it. But more importantly, because I, in my short time in politics here in Virginia, relatively speaking, have seen the good and the bad and the ugly of the Virginia Way.
Actually, it's on the left.
It's always on the left. We go left, right? We have seen how the Virginia Way has been fighting back against all the progressive change that we've seen over the past couple years. Up until 2 years ago, most of our legislature did not look like the people in this room. Most of the legislature did not look like Virginia. In a very rapidly, increasingly diversified, Commonwealth, we saw a legislature that looked like the olden days. It was a good old boys club. It still is largely, but now that we have folks that have run for office, folks that don't come from your general, traditional politic background, your lawyers, your doctors, your wealthy folks, people that come from money, entering into the political sphere, whether it's being elected, whether it's running for office, whether it's being activists, folks in different spaces, we're starting to see that this system was not made for people like us. It wasn't. a 32-year-old biracial millennial from LA being on a border county supervisor that had been white for 150 years. That doesn't happen, but it did. And so as we enter these spaces that we weren't not ever made for, we're starting to see on why we were kept out of those spaces for so long. Because when it comes to power and political change, it's not made for folks that actually represent people. It's for folks that represent corporate influence and power, frankly. And this is baked into how this Commonwealth was created. It's baked into how this country was founded. And now that we're at a touch point now, especially this year, where we can decide what trajectory we want to take moving forward, it's important that folks like you get involved, get educated, and keep this conversation going beyond this room. So now I'm going to get off my stump because I'm not here to talk. You're here to hear from these folks. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to have each panelist introduce themselves, speak very briefly about what organization, technology, what organization they may represent, what the work they're doing in their sphere, and then we'll bring it back to Jeff to open things up. So again, let's start with Jeff, and we'll just do brief introductions moving forward.
Thanks, Kenny. My name is Jeff Thomas. I'm the author of The Virginia Way. Thank you, Kenny. My name is Jeff Thomas. I'm the author of The Virginia Way.
My name is Sean Perryman. I'm the president of the Fairfax County NAACP.
I'm Liz White. This is very loud. I'm the deputy director of One Virginia 2021, working on redistricting reform.
I'm Michelle Woolley. I'm one of the lead organizers for the Coalition to Repeal Right to Work, which is our anti-union law here in Virginia.
I'm Josh Stanfield. I'm executive director of Activate Virginia, and I was Delegate Lee Carter's campaign manager this year, and I'll be with him in the General Assembly this year as well.
So thank you for that, panelists. As you can see, we have a good cross-section of folks that do different work in different parts of the political sphere. We have social justice, we have racial justice, we have electoral justice, we have redistricting reform. It runs the gambit because when it comes to Virginia Way, it's so systemic. The only way that we start to make change and really supplant and dismantle that system is to have a broad coalition of folks who push from all sides. Without further ado, Jeff, you'd like to lead off?
Thanks so much. Is this your water?
Yes.
Switch out.
Water is life after all.
And how's the microphone for me? It sounds good.
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, thank you all for having me, and thank you to Allie and Tiffany and the Virginia Justice Democrats for all your hard work in making today possible. It's an honor to be here today to talk about the Virginia Way, its problems, and its potential solutions. I'd like to start first with a brief reading from the following book, Virginia, History, Government, and Geography. This book was written by Virginia politicians in the mid-1950s and mandated in Virginia public schools from 1955 through the late 1970s. It's extremely important for understanding the mindset of people who grew up during that time and who are the leaders of Virginia government and our economy today. This is just one paragraph. How the slaves felt. Life among the Negroes of Virginia in slavery times was generally happy. The Negroes went about in a cheerful manner, making a living for themselves and for those for whom they worked. They were not so unhappy as some Northerners thought they were, nor were they so happy as some Southerners claimed. The Negroes had their problems and their troubles, but they were not worried by the furious arguments going on between Northerners and Southerners over what should be done with them. In fact, they paid little attention to these arguments. And I will read from before I move on. There was a commission of politicians that made this. I know you all can't see this. One of the commission members is Garland Gray, who was the #2 official in charge of massive resistance. Garland Gray was a state senator and is Tom Farrell's great uncle by marriage, so you don't get the same last name.
Who's Tom Farrell?
Tom Farrell is the CEO of Dominion Energy. And this is a page from the script that he wrote, produced, and paid somebody to direct for his movie, Field of Lost Shoes, in 2015. This, again, is brief. It's a few lines. Confederate soldiers talking to each other. It says, "I will fight And when we drive the Federals out and they surrender, I will run for the legislature, the other Confederate soldier says, and you'll free the slaves. The first Confederate soldier says, we have to do it, Jack. Our generation, we must. But first, we have to win, or they will destroy everything. This can only be described as a Soviet level of propaganda, quite frankly. And now we understand why, when people like Henry Howell and all these people on the stage are fighting to give working people of all color a good job with decent wages, Ralph Northam and Mark Herring are running around, or were running around fraternity parties dressed in blackface. Virginia Way practitioners are not evil people in their own minds. They are acting on what they believe is true about our history and our values. The Virginia Way is fake history, but it's far deeper than this. The Virginia Way is racist too, and sexist and homophobic, but it's far more than merely implanting the cancer of racism, sexism, and homophobia in the human heart. A scholar named Fred Eichelman wrote his dissertation on the history textbook and asked a commission member what its purpose was. The commission member replied, and I'm quoting, "To make every 7th grader aspire to the colonnaded mansion, and if he can't get there, make him happy in the cabin." That's the point of this book, according to a politician who wrote it. So what is the Virginia Way? The Virginia Way is the dominant economic narrative of Virginia's oligarchy. The specifics have changed over time. The racism, the patriarchy, the historical myth-making, these are all important, but the real purpose is, and always has been, economic. To keep the money in the hands of the plantation masters who own the state and own our government. And this has been going on for 400 years. Virginia was founded as a corporation, the Virginia Company of London, where wealthy investors could buy pieces of our state, use violence to import African slaves and indentured poor white near slaves to grow tobacco and make 1,000% profit on their forced labor. If they were worked to death, which they usually were, the life expectancy of these indentured servants was 1 year. Then there was plenty more where that came from. But by virtue of our numbers, the majority of workers have always had the ultimate power, though we rarely choose to use it. During Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, a biracial revolutionary army found solidarity in their common exploitation. And a poor person's army, half black, half white, burned down the capital and nearly overthrew the colonial masters for good. This should not be overly romanticized, as they also murdered innocent Native Americans, but this threat to the ruling class led to the institution of the Virginia slave codes, to turn black and white workers against each other, rather than against the true enemy, the plantation masters and the oligarchs. After Bacon's Rebellion, there were no labor laws or improvement in economic conditions, but a black person could not testify in court, a white man could. A black slave could be beaten for any reason, a white indentured servant could only be beaten for cause, according to the master. And 100 years later, in 1776, we had the American Revolution, which was really a 1/8 revolution. It was a revolution for white male property owners who went into something resembling freedom. The remainder of the white race faced varying levels of legal and extra-legal oppression dependent upon gender and property ownership and other factors. And the other half of the population went into gulag, a totalitarian gulag called slavery. During this time, the colonial ideology of the Virginia Way was reshaped and renamed. It's not all bad, and we do have things to be proud of as Virginians. The First Amendment, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, are perhaps the foremost exemplars of those freedoms in the world. But when we severed our ties to the Church of England, Virginia's founding fathers replaced the church religion with our own state religion, this Virginia Way. Virginia is unique in America in using the term rector to describe the chair of the board of its public universities. This is straight from the Church of England, and Thomas Jefferson, as we all know, was the first rector of the University of Virginia. And in addition, in this state religion, to St. Jefferson, we had St. Washington, St. Madison, Archbishops Lee and Byrd, and today we live in the reign of immortal people called corporations, chaired by Dominion Energy. At the same time, these founding fathers were preaching the most sublime virtues. They were practicing the most abject barbarity. St. Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal while he was raping his half-sister, Sally Hemings, and enslaving their own children. Sally Hemings, it was very well known at the time that Jefferson had two families. It did not take DNA testing to prove that. But at the same time, in all his letters, you have no mention of the second family. Only mention of his property. That's an astounding degree of self-delusion. This denial of reality is not limited to one person, but this was what, according to historians, all white masters with two families did, with the true ancestry of many passed down only through family oral history. White masters' two families existed in everyday reality, but an entire society, in thousands of independent decisions, could not admit that, even in private writing. This extreme denial of reality continues to today. In Richmond, we have the state capitol, designed by the author of the Declaration of Independence. A mile away, we have St. John's Church, where Patrick Henry said, "Give me liberty or give me death." Halfway in between, we have Shockoe Bottom, which was the largest slave trading center on the East Coast, where hundreds of thousands of innocent people were brutalized, were victims of torture, and were killed or sent to die. The reason for this is by the 1700s, the tobacco fields had ample labor, so human children were a surplus cash crop for Virginia slave owners who could be sold for profit to the cotton and sugar gulags. In a city like Richmond that claims to worship history, the site of this world historical slave market in 2020, as we sit here today, is a vacant lot with a plaque. If you go to Richmond, there's a mood to the place. There's something different about it. You can't touch it, but you can feel it. One of the reasons I wrote this book is so people can understand that feeling, that sense you have that something is wrong is correct. And ordinary people can have intellectual courses of self-defense against the plantation masters who continue to deny racism, sexism, oppression, patriarchy, exploitation. What you sense in Richmond is a collective trauma, which, as the Bible says, has been visited from the fathers to the sons, to the sons, to the sons, down to the fourth generation. And daughters, of course, we might add. We as a people cannot preach the most sublime words while perpetrating the most evil crimes without causing a spiritual crisis and trauma inside ourselves and amongst our people. We cannot live openly, and our hearts cannot be free when we're burdened with such guilt and shame of this spiritual crisis. It has been paralyzing us since the beginning, and it continues to paralyze us to this day. So why is it important that we have this fake history and this paralysis? Why is it important that we have old textbooks about happy slaves? The mindset, the collective unconscious of the rulers of Virginia comes straight from this history, and is that there are no large problems in our society, according to them. If you cannot see color, if you cannot see racism, then racism cannot exist in your own mind. Therefore, you can't solve problems that don't exist. The mindset of the Virginia ways is in some ways worse than the segregationists in Mississippi and Alabama. People like George Wallace and Bull Connor are the scum of the earth, or were. But there's certain honesty in saying those vile words in public instead of behind closed doors, and then claiming one is genteel to get elected by using code words. If anything, that means our indoctrination is deeper than that of Alabama, because embracing the Virginia way means to live a lie. We all have natural human drives for creativity and freedom. The purpose of the Virginia way is to stunt those drives in order to control the population. The point of the Virginia way is to make you docile, so the people in power stay in power, and the rich old men stay rich old men. and it's worked very successfully for 400 years. That is their real civilizational project, holding on to their wealth and power. The Virginia Way is not about the Civil War. The wounds long predated the Civil War, and the Civil War merely cauterized the wounds. The purpose of the Virginia Way is to make you happy enough, as so many of our so-called leaders are, that they are walking in the footsteps of the sage of Monticello, that they were born in the hallowed breast of the mother of presidents. They're witnesses to a glorious history stretching back to Jamestown and Rome and on and on. It's all a bunch of bull. I mean, go to the Capitol and see the statue to Archbishop Byrd and the Honorable Mr. Lee and the bejeweled scepter, English crown scepter or whatever. The point is to distract you from the problems that actually matter. The people who must contend with this troublesome thing called reality are not taken in by the myth of the Virginia Way. When independent observers look at Virginia, they understand well how broken our state politics is. Bob McDonnell and Ralph Northam were two of the most popular governors in recent history, and they are laughingstocks globally, with good reason. Oxfam, the world's most respected anti-poverty charity, ranks Virginia as the worst state to work in America. According to the Commonwealth Institute, Virginia is now the most unequal state in the country, and is more unequal than at any time on record. In the National Health of Democracies project put on by a number of leading nonprofits, Virginia was ranked 50th out of 51 states in the health of its democracy. Quite rightly so, because Virginia is not a democracy, it's an oligarchy. Other people well understand it, because they don't read those textbooks. They know reality for what it is. The last several years have also seen some electoral progress for women, but it has been limited. While Virginia had been dead last in gender equity amongst elected officials in 2013, dead last. In 2018, it had climbed to 37th out of 50. Hardly something to be proud of, quite frankly, but progress nonetheless. And once you understand the Virginia Way, you knew very well that our Democratic leaders were going to betray us as soon as they got elected. Understanding the Virginia Way is a useful tool. Understanding the Virginia Way is a tool for predicting how things are actually going to work. The Virginia Way is bipartisan on economic issues, because there's only one party in Virginia, the money party. The differences between establishment Democrats and Republicans are on social issues only: abortion, gun rights, gun safety, marijuana possession, LGBT, etc. And those are important. I'm glad that we are moving forward on those. But Speaker Fillicord and Majority Leader Saslaw have appointed the most corrupt group of hacks and clowns in charge of the committees that are going to kill every single piece of legislation that matters to working people and that hurts donors. Okay, there's no difference between what they will pass and what was passed last year under a Republican government, Republican General Assembly. If you understand the Virginia Way, you knew well that we were going to expand Medicaid because it helped the donors. That's what the business community wanted, and people could make money off of it. Dick Saslaw debated Republican leader Tommy Norment a few years ago. And Dick Saslaw said, quoting, "Go ask Dominion, go ask any of these companies, beer and wine wholesalers, banks, the development community, every one of them will tell you. They will tell you I'm the most pro-business senator." I mean, who says this? Why is that something to brag about? This is from a Democrat. The real election for the Virginia Way was held in June 2019. When Yasmin put on a heroic fight and lost to Dick Saslaw by 2.9 points, with the third individual getting 5 points, Karen. The Virginia Way is not pro-business, despite what people like Dick Saslaw say. And it's tragicomic to hear our politicians proclaim that again and again as if it were true. And as if anybody should care what some CNBC intern has to say when he or she makes a list about Virginia being the best place to work. I mean, who cares what they have to say? When legislators raise Dominion's electricity rates, it is bad for business. Not good for business, and that money comes out of our pockets and every small and large business as effectively as any tax. The Virginia Way, as the dominant economic ideology of the Virginia oligarchy, is pro-donor, not pro-business. Virginia is the only state in the country where corporations can give unlimited amounts of money to politicians who can spend that money on personal expenses. Another uniquely Virginian virtue. Virginia politicians give Dominion what it wants, raising electricity rates, because Dominion is historically the state's most profligate campaign donor. So, What should we do? So few Virginians have had the freedom that we now have, and we have the responsibility to make it better. What should we do with our freedom? Look to the people you admire the most, who have had the most success challenging the Virginia way. A few years ago, Josh Stanfield had no money, no contacts, no organization. But he had an idea that he was going to ask politicians to pledge never to take money from Dominion. And he actually got up and did it. Josh would be the last person. Josh is a very modest person. He'd be the last person to tell you this. But he has become the most effective political operative in Virginia. He gave voice and action to something that we were all feeling and wanted to fix, which is Dominion is the head of the snake, and the corruption of campaign finance is the source of its power. Josh Stanfield has done more to challenge Dominion than anyone since Henry Allen. The Virginia way is a mountain that we have to knock down using whatever toothpick or bulldozer or Josh Stanfield we can. Sometimes we can chip it away, sometimes we create an avalanche. And Facebook and Twitter are not going to do it. You have to do it yourself. You have to get up off your butt to actually do it. And we can't just do it amongst our own circle. Meetings like this are important, but we have to directly challenge the people in power. It's not enough just to work in a group like this, bouncing ideas off each other. We have to make the people in power pay attention and to pay. One clue is to understand how the Virginia way works and to do exactly the opposite. If the Virginia way is about oligarchy, then we need to be focused on poverty. If the Virginia way is autocratic, we need to be democratic. If the Virginia way is about fake history, then we have to tell the truth about our own flaws. If the Virginia way is about secrecy and manipulation, then we need to work with transparency and trust. If the Virginia way is about dehumanizing racism, sexism, and homophobia, then we need to focus on humanity in a way that transcends those artificial divisions. Those divisions were instituted amongst us by the plantation owners to benefit themselves. And to my white liberal friends, this does not mean asking people of color only about issues of race. To my male friends, do not ask women only about women's issues. To my straight friends, do not ask people who are different from you only about issues of sexuality, but about every issue, and listen to what people who don't look like you or feel like you but share your values have to say, and act on it. And to any rich white men who sincerely want to make a difference, try following for a change. And try giving away some of that money so people smarter than you can make a difference. If the Virginia way is about isolating people and making them happy in the cabin, then we have to bring people together to fight the plantation owners and focus on their pocketbooks to make them pay us back for the Commonwealth that they have taken from us. Most importantly, if the Virginia way relies on ignorance, then we must fight for equal education for all. Every child in every holler and housing project must have a chance at a decent education. We have the political will to fund public education, and once we achieve a true meritocracy, the Virginia way will no longer hold us back as a people and will become something that only exists in history books. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Jeff. So next up, so I think in the interest of time, we'll sort of forge ahead.
Sorry, everybody.
No, you're good. You had a lot of passion, a lot of topics. It's a large issue, so we appreciate it. So next, we'll move on to Sean.
Just want an introduction.
And how this sort of fits in, because obviously he went through the whole gambit of how this issue touches all manner of things, and obviously you, especially as an NAACP president, you had committees that look at workers' rights and education and not just racial justice. Because to his point, obviously you shouldn't just ask black folks about racial issues, right?
Yeah.
So,
No, thank you again for having me here. And I have to thank Jeff personally, because I've been involved now in Virginia politics for a couple of years, and I've always struggled to understand why it's so difficult, and it's because I'm a less than cheerful Negro. And if I only understood the history, I would know why it's so difficult. No, but in all seriousness, I do think that this history and this miseducation has informed our political leaders. You know, whether we look at, we have state senators, Democratic senators, who are writing about why Confederate named schools are great and we should have more, talking about Chap Peterson. If we look at the top of our ticket, we have, you know, 2 blackface scandals, a guy accused of rape, and this is the team we're celebrating. We get the first woman speaker, but she's also a lobbyist, right? There's always this give and take of what's allowed. Probably gonna get in trouble here, but I always do. So it's, you know, it's this mixed bag of low expectations. And I think it's important that we talk about the Virginia way and what that means for our political leaders, but I think we should talk about the Virginia way and reflect on how we enable that as activists and citizens, right? When we go around talking about vote blue, whoever, no matter who, like, these are the blue that you're voting for, you know? We enable a lot of this behavior, we allow for it to happen. And as an activist, you know, I don't know how much time we're giving each speaker, but
You have about 10 minutes.
okay, great. So as an activist, I first came into this after the Trump election, like probably so many people in the room. And that's what really got me. And I was working as counsel in the House Oversight Committee. And we were kind of fighting that fight every day. But it wasn't enough. I wanted to get involved locally. And as I got involved in the Democratic Party here, I was so disappointed. It was just so, it just knocked the wind out of me to believe that we are fighting this to get these people elected. And once they're elected, they are scared to death to do anything that would upset anyone. And you don't see that on the right? You don't see them saying, well, let's be cautious with how we vote. It's always the most extreme ideas. So for me, I really found my voice with the Fairfax NAACP because it was a nonpartisan organization, and I saw both sides of the aisle were corrupted in some way, whether that be by power or by tradition. And the only thing I would disagree with what Jeff said was that I don't think they agree with us on social issues. I don't think that's the case, especially issues of racial justice. You know, we saw last year that the entire Democratic Party was willing to throw any black leaders and activists under the bus for the most mediocre governor that you could imagine. There's no other state where Ralph Northam would be considered a political superstar. That's just the truth. He's not someone who does the right thing. He's not someone who's going to deliver to us. You know, to talk about the expansion of Medicaid, that is something that was owed. That wasn't some Northam-driven thing that where only he could have done that. But we look at that and we look at how the white pundits and the politicals are debating amongst a bunch of white people about forgiving someone for something they did towards black people. And that tells you the Virginia way, right? Because really in the Virginia way, when you're defining your ethics and your guidelines and what drives you, you're defining who you are and who isn't a part of that. And it's very clear to me who they want in the cabin to be cheerful and to not be involved and not care about what's going on, and who they look at as their constituency, right? Within the last few days, we've had Democratic senators say that they're not for legalization of marijuana. It's not a real issue for anyone. That is in fact de facto legalized. This is at the same time when you have hard facts that, 3 times the arrest for the black community for that. Where you have the majority of Virginians actually saying they want legalization, right? So that means that they are getting their orders from someone else. That they are able to take that and they're able to ignore facts. You look at Senator Dick Saslaw, who's still for the death penalty, right? Yeah. So you look at all these issues, you can't say they're even aligned with us socially. And I'm probably more cynical than the rest, but when you take on an issue like gun rights, if you signal that that's going to be our #1 issue, and you kind of invite that opposition, maybe you're trying to stall so you don't have to get to anything else. So I think we all need to look at what goes on in Richmond, but look at what goes on here in Fairfax. Look who's getting them elected, and look who they're answering to. Because I don't think those things align. I don't think the people that are knocking the doors are getting what they wanted. I don't think they will. So I don't know what that means for people who are happy activists and are happy about that, but I think we can't look at getting any one person elected as the job being over. We have to look at the long game of this, what changes. And before I pass the mic on to someone else, you know, again, when we look at who's the constituency they're answering to. Right now, when it comes to marijuana, they're talking about incremental change of first decriminalizing. And everything here, whether it's the felony threshold, everything is incremental. Our felony threshold in Virginia wasn't raised before last year. It wasn't raised in the last 30 years. It's one of the lowest in the country. And you look at who's being punished for these crimes. It's black people, it's people of color. If your hand's on a stove, you're gonna turn it off quick. But if you have no connection to what's happening to the person burning, you don't even see them, you may say, oh, let's do it a little at a time. You understand what I'm saying? That they have no connection to the community they're burning alive through their policies, through all the things that they're doing. So it's important for me to speak out as the president of Fairfax NAACP, and some people think I do that a little harshly. I don't care, because I think that there are so many people who are suffering in so many ways. And the black community usually is canary in the mine, where we are hit first and hit hard, right? And you know, I don't think we should take that line out, but I think it's so important for the people here in this room to understand that you have a voice that's going to be listened more so than mine in most cases. If you go up there and stand for racial justice, if you go up there and say, I don't care about the Virginia way, this is what I want. If you're not blue no matter who or whatever that stupid expression is, if you're really there for the issues, you can have greater impact, because at the end of the day, we gave them their seats. They are not entitled to those seats. We gave it to them. So anyway, that's my rambling thoughts on the Virginia way and what was said. But it comes up in advocacy in every way, whether we are talking about schools that we're advocating to change the name of, or we're talking about criminal justice policy or environmental change. We are always looked at skeptically, even though Fairfax NAACP has been in this community for 101 years. You know, and I've been in meetings with Kofi Annan, who's in the back there, where they've asked us, well, how long you've lived here? What kind of, like as if we are a constituent. So it's important, it's so important that you get involved, that you hold these electeds accountable, and that you use your power to get this message across. Thanks.
So Sean, thank you for that, because you peel back at a couple of really important things. One, I'd like to just put a pin in the whole idea that the other side, when it comes to these issues, they're not moderate. I have never heard a Republican say, what will the moderate Democrats think if we do this? Has anyone in this room ever heard that? No, right? But yet, when we get into power, we're worried about this miraculous, mysterious, moderate conservative that we're going to drive away by being bold and standing for our values, right? And so to that point, thank you for that. Two, you talked about it. Who participates? Who's involved? Who actually put these people in these seats? And that's a question about democracy, about voting, about who's able to participate in the franchise. And we are one of the most draconian states when it comes to voting rights and things like that. So that being said, Liz, can you talk a little bit about your work in democracy and how the Virginia way sort of interacts or in some cases suppresses democracy?
Sure, hi. Thank you all so much for letting us be a part of this conversation. I think that the intersectionality in our little nerdy, very niche issue, it's nice to weave it into a kind of a greater thread of justice. So the Virginia way means that the people in power get to decide who's important. And in thinking about how our issue applies in getting ready for this panel discussion, that is what kept striking me, is that there are 140 people who have decided that the only people who are important in the redistricting process are those 140 people. Not their majorities, not their bases, not even their parties, the 140 people. And we look back at the maps that we're currently under, minus anything fixed by courts. So we look at 2011, and it is really easy, because we're a nonpartisan organization, we a lot of people on the left assume that we're sneaky Republicans, a lot of people on the right assume we're sneaky Democrats. I hope that means we're doing it right. But we look at 2011, and it's obvious that this is not a right or left issue. There is not one party that is great. There's not one party that's all bad. On this issue, both sides actually applies here. But 2011, the Democrats had the Senate and the Republicans had the House, and each one got to draw maps for their caucuses or for their chambers, and then they just sent it over to each other and passed them like regular bills. Now, Dick Saslow and George Barker's maps in 2011 were a little bluer until Bob McDonnell made them try again, but they still were blue gerrymandered. They just weren't as good at it as the House. So the Senate flipped a lot earlier. But so there are Democrats in the House voting to pass that map, and Republicans in the House voting to pass the Senate's map, even though it's going to hurt their colleagues over there, and vice versa. It is so much more about personal power than it is even about partisanship. And so even more than catering to their base, I mean, certainly always catering to their donors, but it is truly about keeping their seat. And if their colleague over in the other house, or even someone else in their house, is going to have a tougher re-election, okay, it goes into an inherent conflict of interest. One of my favorite stories is Jen McClellan spoke to a group on our behalf a few years ago. And she said, you know, when in 2011, the House Republicans who were in charge came to the House Black Caucus and they said, what do you want? And there was this kind of unholy alliance that would make sure that those maps got through. And she said, and they said, draw your district. Jen's in Richmond. She had like the second bluest district in the state. She goes, this is not about my re-election. I picked my mom's house. I picked my son's school. And she said these were not nefarious choices. These were not about getting re-elected, but they were about me. And that's why you can't let us do this. It's a bit of a tangent, but I just think that so much more than trying to do right by their party, or certainly trying to do right by their constituents, their instinct, and now with the tools at their disposal, they just do right by themselves and by their re-election strategy. Moving forward to 2018, when the court mandated that 11 majority-minority districts be redrawn, that a racial gerrymander be undone after 8 years of having their voters live and vote under these unconstitutional maps. So now they're fixed, they're better, but they're still, that's 8 years lost that we can't get back with any court decision. So 2018, the Republicans presented maps and the Democrats presented maps, and a bunch of us were in the room. A lot of our supporters who care so much about these maps are in the room during the special session, and we're watching the Republicans who are still in power present maps, and we expect that they're going to not be great. But the Democrats got up and presented maps too, and they did nothing to improve minority representation. I think instead of 12 majority-minority districts, it got up to 13. Other national groups have done mathematical models that show it could be up to 16 or 17 without really breaking a sweat, or a 20-something% black state. 13 is unacceptable. And the maps were a gerrymander. They were as windy, as selfish, as disingenuous as the Republican maps. In a position where we were saying, they're playing with House money. They weren't going to get anything passed. This was their opportunity to get them to go see, this is how it could really be, this utopian future where you elect us next year. This is how we would draw maps. And they didn't. They couldn't even do that. So it is something we are going to have to pry from their fingers. So I feel like this is a very well-informed room, but I will briefly recap where our issue is. We passed, the legislature passed a constitutional amendment last year. It was a bipartisan bill passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, and we're pretty sure the Republicans are still on board because they're in the minority now. So the most fervent opponents of redistricting reform are now very big supporters. And a lot of Democrats signed on to this, and a lot of them campaigned, and I know a lot of them really do believe in doing the right thing. And a lot of them don't. So there are some raising concerns that are absolutely valid, and there is a ways to go to pass enabling legislation to shore up this bill and to put as many parameters, as many transparency measures as we can. And then there are some making really disingenuous arguments, and I wish they would just come out and say, we just want to do Blue Map. So I think with a lot of things, there's not a huge difference between the parties, and on this issue, it's going to be up to all of us to break through the Virginia way and pry this, we always call it the one ring to rule them all. Really make sure they throw it in the river of flames, the mountain. Anyway, but to make sure that we destroy this weapon before the next group of legislators, regardless of their party, can use it to benefit 140 people instead of all of us.
So before,
Oh, yeah.
sorry, before we move on, Sean, did you have something you wanted
Yeah,
to say?
just one point. No, I was thinking about what you said about the gerrymandered districts, and if you think about it, for the last decade or so, there are local minorities who, under the Constitution, legally have not been represented correctly.
Absolutely.
Like we don't often think about this, what this actually means in practice, that you do not have representative government for those people. And it goes from this Virginia way, the kind of consolidating power goes from as issues as high as gerrymandering to as low as the school board seats, which are essentially selected by 100 people that are part of the Democratic Party that paid $70 to be a part of it as a poll tax. And we don't think about these things. So anyway, that's all.
Thank you for that. So you spoke about democracy and how they've been using these tools to suppress votes, to keep people segregated legally in their districts. And something that Jeff spoke to earlier in his initial remarks was the workers' movement and how, they basically pitted poor white folks against African Americans, and they basically used that hierarchy to then be, instead of an equitable thing where workers had collective rights against employers and things like that, they basically then co-opted the white working poor against people of color. That being said, Michelle, would you like to speak to workers' rights and how that bakes into everything that goes on?
I'd love to. I'd love to. Thank you for having me here today. Do you need it's on?
Switch on?
It's on.
Oh, it's on, huh? Okay.
This one's very loud if you want.
Do you want me to take first instead?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, this is just a little bit about the organization that I'm up here representing, the Coalition to Repeal Right to Work. A lot of you have been involved. I see a lot of familiar faces have been very helpful. We're a very grassroots effort of non-union organizations coming together to support repeal of right to work. We're up to about 40 organizations, and we did that in just a couple weeks' time before we got into holidays and stuff. We're looking for more members. If anybody wants to sign on, I can give you information afterwards. And what we're looking to do is just repeal Virginia's right to work law. Now, I think a lot of people have misperceptions about what right to work is. The law itself, basically what it does is it was designed to bankrupt unions. And it makes it so you can have a unionized workplace, but not everybody has to pay their dues. But the union still has to represent those folks. And it was born out of racism and keeping black and white workers apart, divide and conquer. This whole theme I think we're hearing throughout this panel. And right to work, I think it's nefarious in that it undermines the power of working people, of the working class. Anybody who is not one of these old white guys that we're talking about, and it undermines those. But it goes beyond just like the exact wording of the law. To me, I used to be a labor and employment lawyer, and every time I would have a worker come in who had been fired, doesn't matter if they're white collar, blue collar, whatever, would come in, they would say, well, I know Virginia is a right to work state, so I can't really do anything about this. And I was like, well, that's not actually what right to work means, but it's this perception that then also you have no rights, and this is just how it is in Virginia. And so that's what we're getting together to address this. And right to work law has not been repealed in the United States in about 70 years, since the 1950s, I believe. And so what a wonderful thing if we can make that happen in Virginia and break that rule, break that historical pattern. But we talk about this as the Virginia way. From a labor perspective, this isn't a problem unique to Virginia at all. I just see this as like one facet of it. We have not had, I think the Democratic Party on a whole has not actually really decided that it's pro-union. I think we think about it as that way, and that's not the case. We have not had a pro-labor president since LBJ. Because I never realized Barack Obama, who did a lot of great things in other ways, he was not a pro-union, pro-labor president. And I think that's something to keep in mind when we're thinking about, this in the context of Virginia, but also on a bigger level. One of these things that I think is also, important to keep in mind that you have one person can make a difference on these issues. When we talk about this in Virginia, I'm sitting next to Josh had been, Delegate Lee Carter's campaign manager this last time around. He's sponsoring the legislation again. He sponsored it last time. Every Democrat in the House of Delegates signed on in support of repealing right to work the last time. The Senate's a little bit dicier. And now I think that it's a reality. We're starting to see this a little bit more hesitancy in like making this happen. In that we think it should be an easy lift, it should be a no-brainer, right? Let's get this done. But it also, the importance of having that one person who's like very committed to this issue to keep forcing the issue, keep forcing that amongst the party, and it provides a level of shame. Like, why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you supporting this issue? And so I want, and we have other great delegates who are good union supporters as well, and are supporting on this, but it shouldn't be one person, but that can really make a big difference when you're looking at this. And then I guess, I think one other thing too that isn't coming up here when we talk about the Virginia way. So we have our part-time legislature, which is incredibly, ridiculously low paid, right? So we're talking about making $17,500 a year if you're in the House of Delegates, $18,500 for the state Senate. This job is not a part-time job, and it's given all of the effort that goes into it between, I know you have a 2-month session, but outside of that, there's a lot of work that goes into it. And I believe, I don't know what the stats are now, but it used to be that over half of our state legislature was lawyers and doctors. And because those were the people who had the time and the ability to walk away. It's not working class people. It's not unionized. It's not the unionized, person working on your stereotypical working on the manufacturing line, somebody working in the service sector. By and large, it's not those people. And we purposely, by keeping that salary at such a low level, we keep working people out of the conversation and out of power. And I think that that's actually just a thing that we don't really, it's not talked about in the context of that conversation enough. And yeah, so I guess that's about all I have to say on this stuff.
Yeah, so thank you for that, Michelle. And I'd like to put a pin on something you said in terms of not the folks that currently represent us don't necessarily represent us from current, in terms of what the workforce they represent, the industry they're in, what have you. Something that Sean said earlier, they're not connected to workers' issues because most of them aren't your typical working class person. If someone tells them, hey, we're not being paid enough, but the person they're telling that to makes 6 figures, they can't really relate to that. So I appreciate you saying that.
And I thought of something else I should. Okay, and I meant to put it, you mentioned the Oxfam study too, and I just wanted to go back to some of the stats on this and why the right to work repeal is important. And so we do rank 51st in the United States, so according to it's a study. You can go read it online. It looks a little long, but it's actually a pretty easy read. You can skim over it. There's a lot of good stats in there and data. And that's based on our minimum wage and how close it is to being a living wage. Let's see what else. Worker protections, and the right to organize. And so we rank below Mississippi. We rank below Alabama. All of these states that you typically would think of as being anti-worker, and we are below them. DC, our neighbor, for those of us up here in Northern Virginia, is number 1. And so I think that contrast, makes it, and how tightly connected our economy is to DC, I think is also an important one to note. When people are in unions, when we're talking about unionized folks, they make, more than 20%, the stats range for who you're talking about, but 20 to 30% more than non-unionized workers. African Americans are more highly unionized than white workers. When you talk about closing the pay gap for people, people of color, women, Black, African American, Hispanic, like across the range, you're closing these gaps. when we talk about the fall in, economic disparities now that are happening, and how the bottom keeps sinking while the top keeps rising, that those gaps were shorter when unions had more power. And so that's why this issue is important as well. And we're talking about this, it's a very intersectional issue, but it's, everybody rises up, white working class people as well rise up when they are unionized. It's not just about certain segments of the population, but that everybody comes up when you have this unionized and have the ability to have strong unions within in your state, community, country.
So to bring that all back, so we talked about quite a few different issues here, right? We talked about racial justice, we talked about democracy, we talked about workers' rights. And the common thing you're seeing is when they divide and conquer, they diminish the power that people have. And frankly, in a state like Virginia, where we have unlimited campaign contributions on the state level, you get a lot of power consolidated into people actually have means to actually influence the process. Because either you're a working class person, you can't have any time to go work on a campaign, and then you probably don't have enough money to donate to a political person, so you're really locked out of the process. So to bring it all back home, one of the biggest things we have to talk about today is the influence of money in politics, and the dominion of dominion, pun intended, when it comes to how they have influenced the political system of this state since time immemorial. So that being said, I'll turn it over to Josh Stanfield to talk about some of the work that he's done and how the landscape is in terms of political standpoint with corporations.
Thanks, Kenny. Thanks everyone for showing up, and thanks Jeff for the terribly uncomfortable phrase. So yeah, I thought it might make more sense, especially since I know a lot of you or some of you are familiar with Activate Virginia. Instead of going through and laying out the case for why Dominion is problematic, I want to talk about sort of some of the experiences I've had trying to confront the Virginia way. First of all, through Activate Virginia specifically, but also more broadly and theoretically, so that maybe you can have some ideas about ways you could operate, maybe a little more confrontational, but something that might have some success. I mean, there's always an element of luck involved, certainly the case with the Activate Virginia Pledge, but there are situations that make these sort of things possible in moments. And we're still in this political moment, I believe, where anybody, even with no money and with relatively no power, can have a good idea, get lucky, and just attempt to execute, fine, especially now in Virginia, there's a lot of people who will help you. Maybe that wasn't always the case, but it's definitely the case now. So, thinking about Activate Virginia, there are four things that we've done that I think were attempts to confront the Virginia way. The first, when we started the end of 2016, was recognizing that our Democratic Party, our Democratic caucus on the House side, hadn't been historically recruiting candidates to contest these House races. So, heading into 2017, we look at the data and realize that in 2015, I think 71 of the House of Delegates incumbents were unopposed for re-election, right? 71% unopposed, no opponent. So consider this, right? If you are interested in democracy, well, one of the preconditions is that there's actually a choice in elections. I mean, that's sort of necessary. So the idea was to recruit. Go around and see, if anyone's interested in running in a lot of these districts that were considered unwinnable. I think one of them would be, say, Lee Carter's HD 50. I'd say all these districts in Prince William County, Kenny can tell you about the 51st, and these were held by Republicans for a very long time. And that's one of the reasons why you didn't see our caucuses putting a ton of money in a lot of these places into campaigns constantly. So we thought, let's try to recruit some people. And as many of you know, you're part of this process. Immediately after the election of Donald Trump, and especially after the Women's March, you had a lot of these, I guess derisively called pop-up groups, but a lot of these sort of social organizations emerged that wanted to do some kind of political work, often not knowing what that meant. A lot of these groups recruited candidates, or candidates that were just part of that group decided to run because no one else was. That was the first way that we really tried to deal with one of these major problems. Just have competition in elections. The second thing was the question of campaign finance reform. And so when you think about, at the end of 2016, and you're looking at Virginia, and we're barely out of a super minority in the House. in terms of the Democratic Party, there is no way you could sit there and think that there's going to be legislation passed in Virginia to change the corrupt campaign finance system. I mean, that's a completely bizarre impossibility at that point. And so the thought was, what can be done, recognizing the reality that the way you change this, which is by changing the law, isn't going to happen with these legislators of either party. And one thought was, well, let's, in looking at all these new candidates, you're looking at a pool of individuals, many of whom haven't been reminded that the Democratic Party line is, we're fine with Dominion, we take their money, we do what they want. Didn't know that. And so really the pledge was ultimately like a PR effort, really. I mean, a symbolic PR effort. And it was just a matter of getting, once we got 50 people in this pledge, you're gonna get it in the newspapers. And then it snowballs and provides the cover for candidates who otherwise didn't want to get the pushback from leadership or whatever, to say, well, how risky is this really when there's 60, 70 candidates on board with this? Where's the risk really? Then, over a dozen of them win in 2017. Clearly there's no electoral risk either, right? At that point, it just snowballs, and now there's over 200 candidates who have signed up for General Assembly and Congress. I've already got for 2020, almost, in fact, all the non-incumbents so far that are running in Virginia for Congress are already on board. That was an attempt to apply pressure to the Virginia Way on the campaign finance front, and ultimately I heard the word come up: shame. Shame some of these politicians who claim to care about campaign finance and democracy and corruption, but aren't willing to answer a simple question. Will you stop taking money from just one corporation? Which honestly really isn't, a substantial amount of any representative's money, except for maybe Dick Sasslaw, a handful of others. So that was the campaign finance side. And then something that we continue doing, this is critical, and some of the champions of this are in the room, like John Sokoloff. FOIA. FOIA is so important if you're a citizen. This is one of the most incredible sources of power you have, whether you know it or not. Because ultimately, in terms of Virginia, although there are like 130-something exemptions where they can try to wiggle out of giving you something, ultimately, if you write a FOIA request on a cocktail napkin and give it to an elected official or someone in part of a public body, they have to respond to it in a very specific, timely manner. Jeff Thomas, a master of FOIA. In a way, I learned from one of the best when it came to FOIA. So you do these FOIA requests. Jeff and I do a lot of them. Sometimes you don't really learn much. Sometimes the public bodies are not forthcoming. Sometimes, like our friend Paul Goldman had to do this year, you have to take them to court, like he did with the Stoney administration and won every time, because they don't want to turn over something. Or they want to charge you thousands of dollars for a handful of documents, right? Something like that. But that's another thing that we've been doing. This is a way of simply finding out what a lot of us suspect is happening, right? But finding evidence of it. So whenever there's a tip that comes in my email or something, well, maybe I send a FOIA request off to about some random document, and no one knows why they're getting it, right? Or is there a story involved? That in itself is an incredible asymmetric form of pressure on people with a lot of power. When, if you don't have any money to give a lot of money, what are you going to do? That's another tool that I've been employing, and especially when it comes to uncovering Tom Farrell, Dominion Energy, and their role in the proposed Coliseum redevelopment plan in Richmond, which is a project I've been focusing on a lot while running Carter's campaign, and Jeff has also been focusing on a lot in terms of investigatory work. We found out so much from FOIA and in those cases, and in a way really informed a lot of the conversation, a lot of the reporting as a result. Things that reporters themselves maybe didn't have the time or even know was there to do on their own, right? And then the other sort of, it's not really just public information, right? Just putting things out there. So, for the first year of Activate Virginia, we tried to, do like we suspected organizations do in Virginia that are political. You start a state PAC, you register with the SEC as a nonprofit, with the IRS, you try to raise money. I realized very quickly, I think like most of our donors are in this room right now, right, from 2017. No, didn't work, right? No one interested, fine. Tried that, but transition. So Activate Virginia isn't even really an entity. It's not a group of a lot of people. It's me and a couple other people. It's a Facebook page, a website, a Twitter account now. shut all that down in 2018, the legal side. And in a way, it's just a vehicle, a network of people who care, and a way to get information out to the public that political actors, be it politicians, activists, donors, can't say and put their name on it, right? For whatever reason, because of the Virginia way. They can't let it be known that this is happening. Said it does. It'll get out somehow, right? Those have been the ways. So this is just like the Brandeisian sunlight disinfectant angle. That's been one of the real pushes of Activate Virginia. The pledge took off, and it's just applying pressure on the campaign finance side, recruiting just so that there's electoral competition. That's what we've been doing. I'm not going to go much longer. The only thing I want to say is one of the most important things to recognize that we haven't really talked about is the psychology of the person in power in Virginia. This is very important because if you go into these conversations or go into activism assuming that these Virginia politicians are going to take political action based on what they believe, you're already in a very, very dangerous analytical position. History doesn't match that. That's just not the nature of politics in Virginia when there's infinite campaign contributions, lobbyists everywhere, right? So, I would say that one thing that, and it's a form of cynicism, but it doesn't have to be hopeless. It's really just a stoic, analytic perspective that even politicians who I would consider my friends, Kenny, Lee Carter, so many other people, sorry, but they're still politicians. And when it comes to political decisions, keeping it in your mind that what they feel is the right thing to do may not be the primary, secondary, or tertiary, motive for their decision. They may be in a position where they can't necessarily act the way they want because of circumstances or whatever. So understanding that, and therefore putting politicians and people in power in positions where they feel they have no choice but to do what you want them to do. Whether or not they believe in it, it's kind of academic. That's for them to discuss in private settings with you if they're willing. But that's something to keep in mind, the psychology. That's one thing I always try to remember is, I don't get disappointed by Virginia politicians. Because if you expect them to act as they've always acted, then generally what happens is you only get pleasantly surprised. So I'll stop there.
So now if we could get into a more...
Oh, can I just ask, anybody with questions, can you direct them back this way?
And if anyone has any questions to ask, I have no cards to pass out.
So we're going to get into those very shortly, but before we get into the note cards by the audience, I wanted to have a little organic discussion here between the panelists because each one of you touched upon something that's very important and gets to the heart of some of the problem with this Virginia way. Michelle, I think you put it very, very well, especially in terms of legislature, but even like county board or supervisor like myself. I don't get paid nearly as a supervisor to leave my current job. So I'm reliant on staff, my own staff, and county staff, but more than often than not, I'm also reliant on community groups, interest groups, things like that. Legislators get paid even less than I do by a significant amount. So you're expecting folks that are only in session for 45 to 60 days out of the year, and they can go back to their normal lives if they're working class folks, to become subject matter experts in all these different wide variety of issues. But then the only people they have to rely on are interest groups, Dominion Energy, the fossil fuel industry, corporations, all these folks that have high-paid, very effective lobbyists that are very good at their jobs and making everything they tell you seem like it's a very reasonable thing. Like, how could you not believe this? So to get back to something that you just said, Josh, you're right to not trust us. I'll say that. Because as someone who has to do this as a small part of my everyday life, relatively speaking, it becomes very easy to get locked in that fishbowl where you're surrounded by all these people that get paid a lot of money and are trained basically to convince you that what they're telling you is the political will of everyone else, and it's not. You become a fish that's in water where you don't realize you're in water anymore. So could we then dive into that, which each one of your different groups that you're advocating in, talk about that a little bit, how that influence causes politicians to slow walk or even sometimes backpedal or stonewall things that you're trying to do, which when you talk to the wide variety of people, even in terms of polling, these things are popular, but for some reason, once you get in that fishbowl, whether it's the McCourt building in Prince William County, the government center in Fairfax, or even Richmond, how that suddenly doesn't matter anymore.
Sure, I think one thing that happens when you are expected to become a de facto subject matter expert on such a wide array of topics in such a short amount of time is the opportunity for misinformation is enormous. And there's not a lot of time to discern who's a more reliable source, who's a reliable expert. And I think then as an advocate, your hill to climb with your issue and your truth and your issue you're passionate about just becomes steeper. And there's more things in your way because you also have to overcome, you have to, kind of restart. You get knocked back a little bit by a new aspect of your issue that you have to then dispel the mistruth, re-educate, and then persuade and advocate for and move forward. So again, we are such a niche issue that I'm sure that is amplified enormously with something like right to work and so many social justice issues that are much broader. But yeah, I think that opportunity for misinformation is a huge obstacle in such a whirlwind type of legislative session that we have.
I would also, there we go. I would also say what I've noticed is there's a huge misperception, skewed perception of what's going on and what is popular and what is not popular. And that runs from the school board to the General Assembly. Today, for instance, I'll give you an example. I went to the essentially the pre-delegation meeting before they go down to Richmond for the session. And anyone who attended there, I see some people nodding, it was all gun rights advocates. The whole thing, the whole auditorium, right? So, I mean, imagine if you are a delegate or a state senator, you see that, you're like, oh my goodness, everyone thinks this one thing, right? But then if we look at the election results, that can't be right? So, I think there's this huge opportunity for a misperception of what's popular, especially if the person's coming armed with knowledge and they have a lot of people. But we should be kind of emboldened by that as advocates, right? Because if we go there with even a small room of people, if we're the only ones there on the issue, we can have some sort of impact. But I definitely see this happen where you talk to elected officials or legislators about an issue that statistically, everything else, it's like polling, but there must be someone in their ear who's telling them this is going to be suicide for you. So.
And just to piggyback off of what Sean, and I'm glad you brought some of that up as well. I've worked I'm a graduate of Emerge Virginia, which is a campaign training program for Democratic women who want to run for office. And so I know a lot of these different, women who have been elected. My friend Salome Miles down in Dumfries. I worked on Elizabeth Bennett Parker's campaign in Alexandria. I was Krista Degani Tafty's campaign manager in Arlington, in City of Falls Church. And I think one thing that is also important in sticking up for our elected folks, not just to bash, but it is an incredibly hard job, and the amount of stuff that is coming at you on a local level, if you're at the state level, whatever that is. Like this social media, like just the pit that is Twitter, in my opinion. Like I've told anybody I know who's running for office, I was like, get off of Facebook and Twitter, just get off. There's nothing good that comes out of you being on there. And I think that that's also actually something else. It's not just these corporate paid lobbyists. It's like, it's just the trolling and hate and nastiness that is coming at you as well. And I think especially if you're talking about women and people of color as well who are elected officials, because they get a whole different brand of stuff.
We get trolls.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's just crazy stuff. And so I think, one of the things, like when you're talking about this and how to come at this, so you've got, these high-paid lobbyists and folks that are connected. You've got these nasty people that are just or people you thought you were your friends who have forgotten that you're, we can disagree. Like sometimes you disagree on things. That doesn't mean somebody's a horrible person just because you disagree over like some kind of like local issue or something. And I think that one of those things is it's important to remember is like show up to these, the send off, show up to, your electeds, these events, and just, talk to these folks and building those relationships to counterbalance all that other full-time stuff that's coming at them. And do so somewhat times, I think, in a productive way, not just yelling at somebody, because I think we are. I mean, some of these people are not great people, but a lot of them are just people trying to do what they think is best in the world as well. And so I think that those are kind of things to keep in mind within counterbalancing that as well. And then you're seen as this, advocate and reasonable person, and it's like, okay, your position's making sense to me. So.
Thank you for that. Anyone else before we move on to the other part? So I agree with that, and I appreciate each one of your points, because like I was saying, what happens so often is you get a very skewed view of what is real and what people believe and what's actually popular and what you are represented to do because of that unchecked influence. And it boggles my mind that on the backdrop of that, especially in terms of the Virginia Way, we have this gentleman's agreement that certain people are trusted sources for information even when they blatantly lie to you, right? We get told all the time by some of our elected officials, well, so-and-so came to my office. And it's like, but he lied to you. But he's my friend, but he lied to you. Or so-and-so, I was talking to my colleague so-and-so, but they're in the other party. They have a vested interest in undermining you. But he's my friend. It's this whole sort of thing where you get into this fishbowl, like I said earlier, and everyone becomes your friend. And I'm not against having a good working relationship with your colleagues, with the lobbyists, with people from different fields, because you can trust some of what they say, and they do have some good viewpoints on things. But when it gets to this idea that when you know something is blatantly false, but you suddenly trust it because of who it's coming from, because you have a relationship with them, there's a problem with that. And that's basically how this state has been run forever. That just because you have a relationship with someone, you're uplifted. Or just because you have a relationship with someone, you become a trusted source, even if you know what you're telling someone is patently not true. And when you get to elected officials, that becomes very dangerous because these people are relying on people who are lying to them to make informed decisions on policy that affects everyday lives. So thank you for that. I'm actually, at this point, going to shift into these questions. They're actually pretty good. To bring Jeff back into the conversation.
They weren't written by elected officials.
No, seriously though. So to get Jeff back in the conversation. Exactly. Jeff, what made you write this book?
Well, thank you for whoever asked that question. We talked earlier about whatever the Virginia Way is, let's do the opposite. Right? So the Virginia Way is a state religion, and I believe in the other secular religion, which is I have faith in the people of Virginia to do the right thing. That's why I wrote the book.
So to leapfrog over Sean for a second to Liz, do you think that the current redistricting amendment solves the problem of eliminating partisan maps?
So the current amendment is the touchstone of a comprehensive package that needs to pass. So by itself, it does not accomplish the level of reform that we would want, that our other advocates would want, that any reform advocate is looking for. What it does do is provide the kinds of safeguards and transparency measures that really does cut way back on the chance of a partisan map. I mean, if something has to pass with a supermajority of 6 out of 8 citizens and 6 out of 8 legislatures, and there's an even number of Republicans and Democrats in that room, the odds of something that is flagrantly red or flagrantly blue getting out of that commission is significantly diminished. And that's just on its own. And it does have transparency measures that make every map, all the meetings, all the minutes, all the documents open to the public, and would provide a report on why the lines were drawn. So that's also just a huge part. You can't carve through in the middle of a college campus or a church parking lot without explaining why. And there's not a great reason other than, my opponent lives up there. So put together with the enabling legislation, we have bill numbers. SB 203 and SB 204 have been put forth by Senators Mamie Locke and Louise Lucas, who have been advocates for this issue for a long time and really wonderful allies. So SB 203 is the supplementary pieces to the amendment and provides the actual criteria that a commission would use to draw these maps. Things like keeping communities of interest together, honoring city and county lines, protecting and ensuring diverse representation in every step of the process, from the 5 judges, retired judges who choose the commission, to the commission itself, to ensuring there's criteria to protect minority representation in the maps that result. And then SB 204 is similar criteria that would apply in the unlikely event of a deadlocked commission, where it then goes to the Supreme Court of Virginia. SB 204 would say that any map that comes out of the Supreme Court of Virginia would have to be drawn by a special master, which is what generally happens when courts are tasked with providing maps or producing maps, and that special master would have to follow the same criteria that the commission would. So as a comprehensive package, I don't know that there's a perfect way to do this or a way to 100% eliminate partisan gerrymandering, as long as you have a lot of people who are going to be partisan either way involved in the process. But I think putting citizens at the table with an equal voice for the first time, adding the transparency measures, the protections for minority communities, all together really go a long way to doing so.
Thank you. So the next question I have, actually, just to stay on you for a second, is clarification. So right now, in terms of the process of where we are in that getting that constitutional amendment passed. Now, obviously, the General Assembly, like you said, last year they passed it, and because it's a constitutional amendment, it has to pass again this year, and then go to the voters on a referendum in November to then actually be ratified into the state constitution.
Yes, just in time for the 2020 maps,
And
2021 maps.
Then is there any wiggle room to change anything, or do we have to rely on this companion legislation that you've been talking about?
Yes. You can't change the amendment in the middle of the process, so the amendment itself has to remain exactly the same, not a comma different. So when it was being finalized last year, and when we were working with George Parker, when we were working with our other allies and some unlikely allies, but when we were coming up with the final version of this, or when it was being decided, it certainly wasn't by us, but when it was being decided, a lot of things were intentionally left vague. One, because the Virginia Constitution and the Virginia way, we're not like California where there's pages and pages and pages of amendments. They like to keep them short. A couple senators balked at having the word website in the Constitution. So some things were left intentionally vague, and in kind of a gamesmanship move, a lot of things were left vague that people thought with a Democratic majority, which seemed likely, we could get better legislation than we could maybe last year. So we do have to rely, if we want to add anything or shore up anything that's in the amendment, it is the enabling legislation that we are reliant on.
Can I just make a comment? Because the enabling legislation is outside of the amendment, and it's the amendment that goes into the Constitution. So you said that you need a supermajority to pass the maps. So you make it sound like you need 6 out of 8 people to pass the maps, when 2 people can dissent for any reason, and the maps just get thrown away, and they get pushed aside, and it goes to the Supreme Court in Virginia, which is made as a conservative Supreme Court, right, which is appointed by the legislature, which has been for the last 20 years mostly Republican hands. So they don't have any, if it goes to the Supreme Court, they're not bound by the enabling legislation because it's outside of the amendment. They can do whatever they want. Their job is to establish the boundaries, to establish the maps. It is not to be bound by the legislation, the enabling legislation. So they can draw the maps any way that they choose, and whatever maps they choose, we are bound by, and there is no recourse. There is no way to say, we disagree, let's start again. We are stuck with these maps, which I would say would likely be favorable to Republicans. And then most of the people in this room have worked the last 3 years to get the majority that we have, and we will throw it all away.
Why can't we have a new amendment? Everyone says like, we only have to have this in there. I
understand. Let's reel it back a little bit. I think that because there's so many issues to talk about, I'm reluctant to spend so much time on this one issue.
I agree with you too, but everything that we have fought for and everything that everybody in this room wants is going to be dependent on this legislation. Because this legislation is incredibly important to our future. And if this legislation goes through, as I just said, we can kiss goodbye our majority. We can kiss goodbye our influence. And Brian Cannon, who is the executive director of One Virginia 2021, I was in the Arlington discussion group. He said he doesn't trust Democrats either. And I said to him, "You really don't trust them?" He said, "No." So I don't
Trust Dick Saslow? You trust Dick Saslow?
So, okay, folks, before, no, ma'am, if you could, sorry. I'm sorry.
This is important. Let's give Liz a chance to respond.
So,
Talk
yeah,
about
so
this
that's
issue
what
for a
I'm
few
saying. So
minutes.
we can, I just don't want everyone commenting.
Why
So-
not?
But I'm happy to answer that because I know that is the doomsday scenario, and that is the fear, and that is, I think, what's driving a lot of concern, especially in the grassroots level, for people who have worked so hard to elect these Democrats and get this majority. And I am a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat. I mean, it's a nonpartisan organization, but I'm a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat, and I absolutely understand. When I talk about misinformation, there's a lot of it going around out there, and it is simply incorrect that we cannot bind SCOVA with legislation. We bind them with legislation all the time. Mandatory minimums are legislation, and SCOVA has to abide by them. We have spoken to tons of experts. I mean, you don't need to take my word. You certainly don't need to take my word, but you don't need to take Brian's word that we can bind SCOVA. We talked to Dick Howard, who wrote the Constitution. He says we can bind SCOVA. So right now, SCOVA is the backstop anyway. So if the legislature can't come up with a map, if the bill just doesn't pass, because without the amendment, they're just regular bills, statutory bills, like anything else. And if the bill doesn't pass, if they can't get maps, it goes to SCOVA, and it goes to SCOVA without any guardrails at all, any criteria. And then we're exactly where we are now. This at least puts guardrails on SCOVA. And the other part of it is that all the other states that have commissions, SCOVA's their backstop, because the alternative the Democrats put forth as a backstop is the legislature. Why bother with a commission? Then again, we're back where we are now. So a lot of other states have SCOVA as their backstop, and not once has there been a commission that deadlocked and sent it to their Supreme Courts. So the other small piece of this is that part of the reason that it's unlikely that it even goes to the Supreme Court is because courts don't draw maps. They hire people to draw maps, and they're people who don't care where Dick Saslow lives or where any of the Fairfax Democrats live, even though they're 2 miles apart. They don't care. They're just going to draw whatever. Not whatever, but they're going to draw based on the criteria they're giving and not what the legislature wants at all. I don't know why they would give up having 8 of their own people, 4 of them from their own party, in the room and get whatever they can out of that room. I don't know why they would give that up to put it in the hands of a stranger from California. Dick Saslow and George Barker, who I know are as partisan as they come, for good, for bad, they are Democrats. They are looking out for Democrats. They put this in as a feature and not a bug. They said this is the way to go. I know there's a lot of discussion on this. I know that it's something we're all trying to work toward making better. To briefly answer your question, sir, the only way that we can bind the legislature before the 2021 maps are drawn is to amend the Constitution, because you can pass whatever statutory bill you want this year. They are under no obligation to obey it next year, because the Constitution says the legislature draws the maps in years that end in 1, and that supersedes anything they pass. And so if we pass legislation this year, it is a matter of trusting Democrats to honor it next year. And I wish we could. Oh my God, I wish we could. And I know we can trust a lot of them. There's some who are really good on this and really want to do the right thing. And then there are some who want to stay in power.
I'm curious, just very quickly before we move on, how many people in the room, by a show of hands, support the solution or legislation that Liz is talking about?
With the enabling legislation.
With the amendment, and how many, so about a third, maybe-ish, how many oppose? Less than, okay, most people abstain. Okay, just curious.
But you do bring up a good point, because at the end of the day, you're right. Our judiciary has a bunch of Republicanly appointed folks in there. So that legislation can help. It does put up guardrails. But at the end of the day, we need to keep our majority, because just like we saw in the Supreme Court of the United States, if we don't have our folks at the table making those appointments on things outside of this, we're going to lose a lot of rights and a lot of things. And I'm sorry.
No.
Sorry. So,
We can talk.
yes.
No, I want everybody to hear this. You and I can talk, but
Sure.
I got what he's on.
So if we can move on, I'm going to jump over to Michelle. What strategy should our grassroots do going forward to support the repeal of right to work?
So I think the biggest thing right now you could be doing is asking your delegates to be co-sponsors of the legislation. I looked this morning, there's a handful on there, but you want delegates and your you in writing also to your state senators and asking them to support. I would actually still say to write to him, so I would not to be dismissive of that. So and to be communicating with them and asking them to because once they're on board as a sponsor or supporter of the legislation, then that means they're voting for it. So
do you have numbers of numbers?
I forgot to grab. This is the one thing I forgot to grab this morning. What is it?
157.
153, I think it's HB one something.
We do have Lee Carr's legislative assistant. Right?
I'm not the legislative assistant.
I'll look it up on my phone and I can give you the bill number. Yeah.
The follow-up, that was my question. The follow-up to that is, our senator is afraid it's an overreach. The other things he's pretty good about, voting for, Serval. But he thinks that right to work is an overreach, that will just make the Republicans crazy. What do I say to that?
I guess I don't understand the premise that it's I guess I don't even understand what his argument is that
it's too much. You're asking the Republicans to.
Well, who cares? I mean, they're not in power. I mean, I don't know. They're not in power.
Exactly. No, I feel that way. I'm just saying that's what I get from him. How do you combat that?
Senator Serval's interesting because I don't know if you guys have seen it, but with Activate Virginia, we have a public whip sheet on the right to work repeal with a list of every Democratic delegate and senator, all their contact information on where they stand right now in terms of what they've said on the record. The two places you can find that we pulled from this data was the whether or not they were endorsed by the AFL-CIO, which apparently the Virginia AFL-CIO, which only endorsed people who said in their questionnaire that they would be in favor of repealing, and also the Chamber of Commerce. The Chamber of Commerce put their responses to their questionnaires online, and of course they asked about it, right? It's incredibly symbolic, mostly symbolic, to the business community about what's happening to the business community in Virginia. And so when it comes to Senator Serval, one thing that was interesting is he told the chamber that he supports right to work, not right to work repeal. He supports right to work, but he's in favor of like a fair share, which is like a kind of a nebulous compromise position right now. I don't think the bill is public yet. I don't know who officially is going to be on it, but he told the chamber this, I want to keep right to work, right? But, we put that in the spreadsheet, and then he went on like the Activate Virginia Facebook page and was like, well, let me clarify, and was saying that apparently he supports right to work repeal only if fair share doesn't happen. So it's like, I really want this moderate, this moderate compromise that really doesn't satisfy anyone, but if I can't get that, then I'm going to take the farthest position that everyone wants. It doesn't make any sense, but that's his position, and it's all.
Yeah, and it's HB 153. And I would also say, I think some of the other messaging around this is, people think about this just in terms of unions, and I think, I started my career in the civil rights movement, and to me, like one of the, working on a criminal justice reform campaign, these laws, and I know Senator Serval's also done some work on, is a criminal defense attorney. I mean, these laws came out of, they're purely racist, you know, and we've got some kind of, you know, we've got this thing in Virginia now where we're talking about repealing all these laws that originated in racism and, you know, were meant, you know, to discriminate against certain people. And so I think that's also an important point to make with some folks. I think that can be a compelling point as well. Yeah, so, and I mean, the fact that I think also that we're just 51st on this like ranking of, workers. Like, I don't think that there's an overreach at this point to get from 51 to 50. God forbid. So, and I think it's just hammering on those. And sometimes, so I think that those are some of the things that you have to do.
Thank you. So, we're going to start wrapping it up soon, but the last question I wanted to ask from the audience is going to be for Sean, since I'm going to ignore you this entire time. Having come from activism with some previous experience, what is the best way to hold elected officials accountable, in your opinion? Participating in the bill process, protesting, activating people, and I want to actually ask a second question that's sort of linked to it. How, in that other vein, how do you see us making our party and our movement more inclusive? In terms of racially, socioeconomic status, what have you, because I feel like those are things that are intertwined, because if we have more folks at the table that are more inclusive, our communities that have elected these people, they're a lot more willing to do what we're going to do. And the final part of this question is, will you move to Fairfax City and run against Chap Peterson? Those are all linked. I think it's important.
Wow. Yeah, I was gonna say that. I was like, I won't have to because Chap's gonna go run the Redskins. So I'll answer your questions or most of them. So you threw me off with that one. The first question was about what is the most effective way. There is no one effective way, and I think that's the problem that some activists run into, and I'm no expert, but in my opinion and in my experience, you can't solve everything the same way. You can't do backdoor deals all the time. You can't protest all the time. You have to look at what's going on. We, for instance, to give you some examples in the last year, when we wanted to stop this, the police being put into elementary schools, we teamed up with Moms Demand Action, right? Because when you get older white women in the room, they tend to listen. So we teamed up with them because we made this an issue about introducing more guns into schools, right? And we also were able to team up with disability community because people who are most disproportionately punished are Black and brown and disabled children. So I think building coalitions could be one. When we had the issue with Northam coming up to, when he was trying to do his redemption tour, the first stop we had was in Fairfax. And we got out there on the front lawn and we stopped him from coming. And we had to do that because we had to be there in person and show, no, you're not okay with all Black people. It's not, we didn't all forget. So, and then there are a lot of things where, we talk behind the scenes and we try to be nice sometimes, and I know that's surprising to people, but we do try to communicate and educate. It all depends on what your problem is, so I think it varies. I think the number one problem, to get to your second question, with inclusion, is that if you're poor, if you are, just a busy person, a young adult with a family or whatever, you don't have the time to get involved, right? So it's meeting people where they are, making it more accessible, whether that be through cost, through the ways that we meet and letting people have so many delegates and state legislators who invite me as president of NAACP to participate in some community event they're having at 11 a.m. on Thursday. I'm at work. And so, if I can't make it there, the single mom struggling with 3 kids who are going through the system can't make it there as well. And these are the people they are going to impact the most, ironically. Not the people who are retired and at these things, hobnobbing with them for the 3rd time that week. So I think we need to think about, and our legislators need to think about, how do we make things more inclusive, or make it more accessible to people to be inclusive. And then finally, I don't have any plans to run for office right now, so thank you.
Right now, the keywords are right now.
Thank you for that, Sean. So we're nearing the end, and so before we get to one last person who's going to speak, I want to give each one of you a couple of minutes, as in 2, to sort of wrap up any final thoughts or remarks things that you think people need to know before they leave this room on how to really tackle this issue. And we'll start on reverse order, so let's start with Josh and come back down.
All right, well, we're almost very, very soon heading into session. This is supposed to be, this could hypothetically be one of the most historic legislative sessions in Virginia since, what, Jeff, the 1880s or something? Readjustment or something? That's possible, right? Obviously, the Democratic House and Senate leadership don't want anything like that to happen. The question is going to be on the House side. I'll talk just about the House side, what you can do. Any bill that you think is meaningful, it's a good bill, it's a bill that Democrats have run on, have talked about, are in line with the ideals they've talked about, demand that the Speaker has a vote on it on the floor. Do not let anything you care about die in committee. There's no excuse for anything to die in committee that you think is meaningful or has been talked about, right? So that's what I would say. Make sure everything gets on the floor, gets a vote, and if you have a delegate who says, well, I'll write the work repeal, I'm for it, of course, but I don't think it's going to go anywhere in the Senate. Well, that's a justification for you voting for it, passing it in the House, and then asking the senators, why aren't you passing this thing? I ran out of support. That's it. Full stop. No conversation about, because in the end, they got to go back to leadership. They got to hear a bunch of, problematic stuff from our whip, who, isn't elected, because it would be difficult for the whips to be able to whip enough votes to be elected within our caucus so they get appointed. Don't let any of the leadership, push these people into cowardly moves. Force them to take the votes on the House floor, and if the Senate kills it, the Senate kills it. We deal with the Senate, right? But that's something that's critical. Don't let anyone tell you that, oh, what's going to happen in the Senate is therefore going to prevent me to vote on this thing. That should not be acceptable. Same with the committee chairs, right? If you know the committee chair, we know the committee chairs right now in the House. Let them know. You expect there to be a vote on these bills in committee. You expect it to get to the floor, and then at that point, it's up to the House to do what they're going to do. But that's one thing I would say for this session: insist that the bills you care about get a vote on the floor. That's really critical. There's a way, if for those of you who don't trust, it doesn't happen.
Josh.
Yeah. I'll talk to you about a way, they don't put it through.
Ditto all of that. Also, a lot of you, I think, are having, you're going down with lobby days with a lot of different organizations that you're involved in. For me, it's talking about, if you could, mention, I expect you to support the repeal of right to work. That's really important to me. Add that to your talking points. We're also having a lobby day. We're joining on with Labor's lobby day on January 27th. So if you don't have plans on January 27th, come join us on that day as well. Yes. So, and to talk about it. Third, I have a list here of, and I can, I'll put these out later, of all the organizations who have joined so far. If you're part of an activist organization that has not joined on with us so far, please ask them to do that. Reach out to folks you know. We've got the Fairfax NAACP has joined in support, Virginia Justice Democrats. We have a couple of environmental organizations that are represented in this room. We have a really broad and diverse group. Yes, thanks. And so we would love to have to just show that this is this isn't just a labor issue, that there's people outside of labor that really care about this. And then finally, we are having a steering committee meeting on Monday at 10 a.m. at the Novo Labor Headquarters in Annandale, and anybody is welcome to come join us. I've also got a call-in number if you're interested in that, just to kind of, we're very grassroots, very non-hierarchical. It's a chip in and get it done. So that's it.
Sorry, can you repeat the day and time?
The day for, it's Monday, this coming Monday at 10 a.m. And it's on John Marr Drive. It's in Annandale. I'll have the event up on our Facebook page, so you can follow us there to get information too.
Solidarity forever. Liz?
Just about every voter wants redistricting reform, and the fact that we are at a point where we're talking about what kind and not if is huge. I'm coming into my 5th year with this organization and on this issue, and that we have come from who's Jerry to arguing the finer points of an amendment is unreal. And I just want all of you to know we haven't, One Virginia, the greater redistricting movement, no one is shutting the door on anything. No one is going, it's my way or the highway. This is it. We have 4 days till session starts, and then a bit of time at the beginning. We're using every moment to comb through every eventuality, to put in place every protection we can, to make as much reform happen as can happen. And we're all moving in the same direction, and hopefully everyone who wants to see this ends up coalescing behind something great. So we have lobby days every Tuesday, between the beginning of session and crossover. We do them by region so we don't crowd the Pocahontas hallways. So the 14th, which is the first Tuesday of session, is the Nova one. They are up on our Facebook, and if you're already on our email list, there'll be an email about that coming out. We meet at 9 in the morning at the SunTrust building, do a debrief, go across the street, and then come back and report back. So I hope you'll join us. Thank you all a lot.
Thanks, Liz. Sean?
If people here aren't NAACP members, please join. That's always great. We're going to actually publish our legislative priorities for this session on Monday, and then we're having the first ever NOVA-led with Fairfax in the front NAACP lobby day. So we're doing that at the end of January. We'll have the exact date that we're announcing probably this week. Just really quickly, just pay attention. Our legislators, there are some good ones and there are some that want to be seen as good. And I think you need to pay attention because, we talked earlier about campaign finance reform. The one time I saw, our legislators really talk about that is when Ray Burrow, the former Commonwealth attorney, was knocked off by a primary opponent because they wanted to stop money coming in that was for progressive candidates, right? It wasn't about Dominion or anything. That was the thing that moved them. So I think we have to, when we hear these buzzwords, we have to be careful. Campaign finance reform isn't always good. They say, oh, we got a climate bill. That's not always good. You have to really look at the details and see what they're doing because they're still motivated by the same things. They just colored it up a little bit better. So that's what I would say. We always have to be watchful, no matter who's in charge, and make sure our voices are heard. And I would never let a legislator tell me that's you're to overreach. Yeah, that's why I elected you. I want you to overreach.
I really don't have anything to add to this illustrious group, and these are the future elected leaders of Virginia. Majority Leader Katie. I'm sorry we didn't get to visit more as an audience, so I'll stay after to chat. I want to hear from you guys. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. And yeah, so I think that there's some very important discussion that's been had, and I didn't mean to interrupt you, ma'am, but we had to move along. But I think that these conversations need to happen beyond this room when we leave here. And something that Sean just said is very, very important. The folks, like with anything, whether it's racism, misogyny, what have you, even in terms of this Virginia way, the folks have evolved on how they've gone about masking what it really is. You'll see bills out there that sound really great, but once you dig into them, they're not. You have the climate space, campaign finance reform, all these issues. They realize the winds are now in their faces. They have to try to masquerade as the change that we need. Well, we cannot allow ourselves to be fooled by them. So I'm going to hand it off for the closing remarks to a gentleman who has run twice now, right, sir? Thank you so much for running. It is not an easy thing to run for office. We did a lot of bashing elected officials, but believe me, we put our entire lives on hold to do this, and this gentleman has done it twice now. So I am honored to introduce to you, Brent again.
Thanks, Kenny. I really appreciate it. I'm Brent Finnegan, representing the red western part of the state, from Harrisonburg, Virginia. I just wanted to briefly say, it's easy to talk about how, this is a movement to deal with right to work and gerrymandering and, corrupting influence of money in politics. But really, this is now the third attempt at repealing the Virginia way in the Commonwealth. In my view, the first attempt was the readjusters in the 1870s and 1880s. The second attempt was with the Henry Howell campaign in 1973. And here we are again. We are now at the cusp of finishing the job. If you're familiar with Reverend Barber, he talks about the third Reconstruction. This is part of the third Reconstruction, this repeal of the Virginia way, creating a new Virginia way. And it's something we need to do not only here in Fairfax, but across the Commonwealth. And so I just wanted to say thanks again to Kenny, our moderator. Let's give him a hand. to our panelists, Jeff Thomas, Michelle Woolley, Sean Perryman, Liz White, and Josh Stanfield. And thanks to all of you for showing up, sitting here in this kind of sweaty, stuffy room. It's awesome. I also just wanted to say, this is knowledge. So what we've shared today is knowledge, but the next step is action. So, now we know about the Virginia Way. What are we going to do about it? So just stay in touch with Virginia Justice Democrats, vajusticedemocrats.com, at VA Justice Dems on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And then join us for actions and events we'll put up on that site, meetups, and make sure to tell your friends and family to get involved in this. If I can do it in Western Virginia, you can do it here, wherever you live. Start a local group, and you can also donate to the cause. So thanks again for coming out, and yes, stick around, and we'll hopefully get a chance to talk with you. All right, thank you. So that's the end of our program, everyone. Thank you again so much for coming. We'll be around here.